I drained my life savings to build their dream life, only to be thrown out like garbage by my son's arrogant wife, while the dirt was barely settled on my husband's grave. The betrayal crushed my soul, but I simply wiped my tears and let her pack my bags, waiting for the exact moment the lawyer would expose the brutal trap hidden inside the trust. I am Evelyn, 65 years old. For 4 decades, I worked as a pediatric nurse in a busy city hospital. My late husband Thomas and I worked grueling night shifts, missing holidays and weekends, just to build a comfortable life for our family. We sacrificed our own dreams to hand our only son Lucas the world on a silver platter. We paid his college tuition in full, so he would graduate without a single cent of debt. We provided the hefty down payment for his first home, and we happily paid for his lavish, overpriced wedding when he married Chloe. I truly believed I had raised a respectful, loving man who understood the value of family and the meaning of gratitude. I believed that when the time came, he would stand by my side just as I had stood by his. But the devastating truth about who my son really was hit me on the absolute worst day of my life. The ground was completely frozen the morning we buried Thomas. It was a bitter, biting January cold that seemed to bypass my coat and settle right into my bones. After 40 years of a beautiful marriage, watching his heavy oak casket lower into the earth felt like a physical tearing of my own heart. I stood by the graveside in my modest black mourning dress, shivering uncontrollably while distant relatives and acquaintances offered empty, rehearsed platitudes. When we finally returned to my home for the repast, the house was crowded and loud. The overwhelming scent of baked casseroles, floral arrangements, and stale coffee hung heavy in the air. I was physically and emotionally exhausted, standing alone in the kitchen, just trying to find one quiet moment to catch my breath and process the fact that my husband was never coming back. That is exactly when my daughter-in-law Chloe cornered me. She did not approach me with a warm hug. She did not offer a glass of water or a single word of comfort for the woman who had just buried her life partner. Instead, she marched right into my kitchen, holding a glossy, brightly colored brochure, and slapped it down aggressively on the granite counter right in front of me. I looked down, my eyes red and swollen from hours of crying, and read the bold letters printed across the front. Shady Pines State Care Facility. It was a pamphlet for a low-income state-run nursing home. It was the kind of grim, depressing place where they warehouse people who have absolutely nothing and no one left in the world to care for them. I looked up at Chloe, completely confused and disoriented. She crossed her arms over her expensive designer dress, a sickening, calculating smirk playing on her lips. She looked me right in the eye and spoke in a tone so chilling it made my blood run cold. She said we needed to talk about reality right now. She told me I could not possibly maintain this huge house by myself anymore. She announced that she and Lucas had decided they were moving into the master bedroom by the end of the month, and I needed to start making arrangements to relocate immediately. She actually pointed at the brochure and said the facility had a bed opening up, and they were willing to drive me there and drop me off so I would not be a burden. Her cruel words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The dirt on my husband's grave was literally fresh. We had not even finished the funeral reception, and she was already trying to discard me. I felt a massive surge of panic and immediately looked toward the kitchen doorway where my son Lucas was standing. He had a plate of food in his hand and a beer in the other. He had heard every single word his wife just said to his grieving mother. I waited for him to intervene. I waited for the boy I raised, the boy I sacrificed everything for, to tell his wife she was crossing a line to defend the home his father built with his own 2 hands. Instead, Lucas cowardly looked away. He refused to make eye contact with me. He shifted his weight nervously and mumbled in a pathetic, rehearsed voice that sounded completely devoid of any emotion. He said the house was just too much upkeep for me now. He said Chloe was right that they needed the space for their future, and I needed supervision. He told me it was just business and asked me not to make things harder than they had to be. Then he simply turned his back on me and walked away into the crowded living room, leaving me completely alone and defenseless against the woman who was aggressively evicting me. My chest tightened so hard I could barely draw breath into my lungs. This was the house where Thomas and I had shared our entire lives. Every wooden floorboard, every freshly painted wall, every piece of carefully chosen furniture held a precious memory of our long marriage. And my own flesh and blood was handing it over to a greedy woman who had never worked a hard day in her life. Before I could even gather my thoughts or wipe the tears from my face, Chloe turned on her heel and marched straight down the hallway toward the master bedroom. A terrible sense of dread washed over me, and I rushed to follow her. When I reached the doorway of the bedroom I had shared with my husband, I froze in sheer horror. Chloe had already pulled a massive black plastic trash bag from her pocket. She walked directly over to Thomas's open closet, grabbed his favorite navy blue silk necktie, the very tie he wore to all our anniversary dinners, and casually tossed it into the garbage bag as if it were a piece of rotting trash. She did not pause. She did not even blink. She just kept pulling his clothes off the hangers, tossing them into the bag with total disregard, complaining loudly that she needed to make room for her own seasonal wardrobe. The utter callousness of her actions told me everything I needed to know. I was not a mother to them anymore. I was merely an obstacle standing between them and my property. The tension did not just linger after the funeral guests left. It exploded into a full invasion the very next morning. I woke up at the crack of dawn to the sound of heavy boots and loud echoing voices in my hallway. I pulled my thick robe tightly around my shoulders and stepped out of the tiny guest room where I had spent a sleepless, agonizing night crying for my husband. Chloe was clearly not waiting for the end of the month to claim her territory. She had decided that the takeover would begin immediately. She was already aggressively directing men carrying heavy cardboard boxes right through my front door. I stood frozen in the foyer, watching in absolute disbelief as Chloe walked directly over to the beautiful brick mantel above the living room fireplace. That mantel held a row of precious silver-framed family photos. Pictures of Thomas proudly holding Lucas as a newborn baby. Pictures of our happy family vacations at the lake. Pictures of anniversaries and birthdays. Chloe systematically grabbed each frame, unceremoniously dumped them into a cardboard box on the floor, and began setting up massive, glamorous, vain portraits of herself and Lucas. She was actively and intentionally erasing my history, wiping away the existence of the loving family that built this home from the ground up. Then the front door swung open wide, and a man I had never seen before walked right into my house. He was chewing gum loudly with his mouth open, reeking of cheap cologne, and wearing a flashy, poorly fitted suit that screamed unprofessional. Chloe smiled brightly and introduced him as her brother Bryce. She proudly announced that Bryce was an amateur real estate flipper, though I knew from past conversations that he was completely unlicensed, drowning in debt, and constantly looking for a quick payout. Bryce carried a thick wooden clipboard and strutted through my living room as if he had just bought the property at a cheap foreclosure auction. He began knocking on my walls, forcefully opening my antique display cabinets, and loudly appraising my personal belongings. He walked right past me without a single word of greeting or a nod of condolence. He turned to his sister and said they could easily gut the entire main floor, knock down the load-bearing walls, and sell all this old lady junk for a massive quick profit. He laughed and said the estate sale alone would generate enough cash to fund the new luxury truck he wanted to buy. He spoke about me right to my face as if I were already dead and buried next to Thomas. He spoke about my cherished home as a messy construction site he was ready to completely demolish. I felt my blood pressure rising to a dangerous level. My hands clenched into tight fists. I followed them as Bryce moved down the hall and stepped right into Thomas's private home office. Thomas had a beautiful vintage glass display case where he meticulously kept his collection of classic watches. It was his absolute pride and joy, representing decades of saving, searching, and collecting. Bryce walked straight up to the case, popped the brass latch without asking permission, and reached his greedy hands inside. He grabbed a heavy mahogany box containing Thomas's most prized gold watch, a retirement gift from the hospital. Bryce declared loudly that this specific watch would fetch a very nice price online, casually tossing the precious mahogany box from hand to hand like a cheap baseball. That was the breaking point. The overwhelming grief vanished instantly, replaced by a surge of pure protective adrenaline and maternal fury. I stepped forward quickly and firmly grabbed the mahogany box with both hands. I commanded him to put it down right now, my voice sharp and unwavering. I told him these items did not belong to him, and he had absolutely no legal or moral right to touch a single thing that belonged to my late husband. Bryce glared at me, his face twisting into an ugly, aggressive scowl that showed his true nature. Instead of apologizing or letting go, he violently snatched the heavy box back toward his chest, aggressively shoving my shoulder in the process. The sudden brutal force caused me to stumble backward, hitting my back hard against the solid wooden doorframe. I gasped in pain, holding my bruised shoulder, shocked by the physical escalation. I immediately looked at Chloe, expecting at least a tiny shred of human decency. I expected her to scold her brother for physically shoving a grieving widow in her own home. But Chloe did not flinch or offer to help me up. She crossed her arms, tilted her head to the side, and looked down at me with eyes completely devoid of any warmth, pity, or empathy. She warned me to keep acting hysterical, her voice dripping with cold, calculated malice. She told me to keep picking fights and throwing tantrums, because she and Bryce were documenting every single outburst. She stated very clearly that if I kept up this erratic behavior, they would have absolutely no choice but to call a medical professional to evaluate my severe dementia. She claimed I was clearly becoming a danger to myself and others. She smiled a wicked smile and said they would easily prove to a judge that I was mentally unfit to live independently, and then I would be locked away in that state facility whether I liked it or not. The vicious threat hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She was not just being a rude, greedy daughter-in-law. This was a highly calculated, premeditated assault on my life. She wanted me to react violently. She wanted me to scream, cry, and fight back so she could build a fake medical narrative against me. She was actively laying the groundwork to have me declared legally incompetent, lock me away in a miserable institution, and liquidate everything my husband and I had worked 40 long years to build. I stood there in the doorway of my husband's office, rubbing my aching shoulder. The tears completely stopped falling. The panic and confusion faded away, replaced by a terrifying, absolute clarity. They genuinely thought I was a weak, vulnerable, clueless old woman who would simply roll over, cry, and let them steal my entire life. They thought my stunned silence was an admission of surrender. But they had made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They had woken up a woman who had spent 40 years managing literal life-or-death situations in chaotic hospital emergency wards. I knew exactly how to stay calm under immense pressure. I took a very deep breath, released my grip on the mahogany box, and slowly walked away without saying another word. I let them think they had easily won the battle, but the war had just begun, and I knew exactly what I had to do next to destroy their entire plan. The days that followed my husband's funeral quickly descended into a calculated nightmare of psychological warfare. Chloe and Lucas did not just want me out of the house. They needed me to appear fundamentally broken to justify their cruel actions. I quickly noticed the subtle, insidious shifts in my daily routine. My blood pressure medication, which I had kept in the exact same spot in the bathroom cabinet for 10 years, suddenly started disappearing. I would search frantically, my heart pounding in my chest, only to find the orange prescription bottles hidden behind toxic cleaning supplies under the kitchen sink, or tucked deeply into the very back of the hallway linen closet. When I calmly asked Lucas if he had moved my essential pills, he would look at me with wide, completely fabricated concern. He would slowly shake his head, put a heavy hand on my shoulder, and ask in a patronizingly gentle voice if my memory was starting to slip away. He acted like a concerned son talking to a confused toddler. The audacity of his performance made my stomach turn. Then came the terrifying incident with the gas stove. I had just woken up from a brief, exhausted afternoon nap when the overwhelming, foul odor of natural gas filled the entire first floor of the house. I rushed out of the tiny guest room and found Chloe standing casually by the kitchen island with her arms crossed. She immediately started yelling at me at the top of her lungs, claiming I was going to blow up the house and kill them all. She pointed at the stove and aggressively insisted that I had turned the burner on to boil water for afternoon tea, and then completely forgot about it. But I had not made tea. I had not even stepped foot in the kitchen since breakfast. I looked at the unlit burner hissing toxic gas into my home, and I knew exactly what they were doing. They were deliberately creating highly dangerous situations to build a fake medical history against me. They wanted documented incidents to prove I was a severe hazard to myself and others. Their campaign of cruelty quickly extended beyond the physical walls of the house. They systematically began cutting me off from the outside world to ensure my total isolation. The landline phone in the kitchen miraculously stopped working one Tuesday morning. When I tried to connect my tablet to our secure home wireless network to send a simple email to my friends from the church congregation, the network password had been completely changed. I asked Lucas to fix the connection so I could reach out to my support system. He patted my shoulder with that same condescending smirk, promising he would get around to it when he had a free moment, which of course he never did. I was entirely cut off from the people who could help me. My church group, the wonderful women I had prayed and volunteered with for over 20 years, suddenly stopped coming by for their weekly afternoon visits. I found out later through the neighborhood grapevine that Chloe had intentionally intercepted them on the front porch. She had put on her absolute best impression of a devastated, worried daughter-in-law, actually forcing fake tears to fall down her cheeks. She told my dear, trusting friends that I was rapidly losing my mind and becoming dangerously unpredictable. She spun a tragic tale claiming that seeing familiar faces only confused me and made me violently agitated. She boldly lied to my friends, stating that my physician had recommended strict, quiet isolation for my rapidly deteriorating mental state. Chloe effectively locked me inside a prison of her own making, surrounded by wardens who were actively plotting my total destruction. I was a prisoner in the very home my husband and I had built, trapped with people who viewed my existence as a temporary inconvenience. But instead of breaking down and giving them the satisfaction of my tears, I decided to play along with their sinister game. I slowly began to shuffle my feet when I walked down the hallway. I intentionally asked the exact same questions twice during dinner. I let my hands shake visibly when I held my morning coffee cup, spilling dark drops onto the table. I gave them exactly the pathetic, broken performance they needed to fuel their fake narrative. They truly believed they were breaking a frail, helpless old widow. They completely failed to realize they were sharpening a survival instinct I had intensely honed over 4 decades of working in high-trauma emergency wards. You learn to stay perfectly calm and completely still when the alarms are sounding and the patient is coding. You learn to observe every single detail in the room. My ultimate confirmation came on a cold, rainy Tuesday evening. I had retired early to the cramped guest bedroom they had forced me into, intentionally leaving the solid wooden door cracked open just a tiny fraction of an inch. I put on my cotton nightgown and lay down on the small recliner in the corner, keeping my breathing deep and steady, pretending to be fast asleep. The house was mostly quiet, save for the muffled, annoying sounds of a television show playing downstairs. But then I heard soft, creeping footsteps approaching the upstairs hallway. Through the narrow crack in my door, I saw Chloe and her sleazy brother Bryce. They were standing near the antique hall console table, bathed in the dim yellow light of the hallway lamp. Bryce was holding a thick, official-looking document that I instantly recognized. It was the comprehensive life insurance policy Thomas and I had purchased 30 years ago to protect our family. I kept that crucial policy locked tightly inside a heavy metal filing cabinet, hidden deep in my bedroom closet. They had actually picked the lock. I held my breath, keeping my eyes half closed, watching them intently like a hawk. Chloe pointed her perfectly manicured finger to a specific line on the heavy paper, tapping eagerly against the massive payout amount. I heard Bryce whisper in his grating voice that it was an incredibly solid policy. He told his sister that once they officially secured the power of attorney over my affairs, they could borrow against the massive cash value immediately without anyone asking questions. Chloe smirked, her greedy face illuminated by the harsh hall light, and whispered back that the money would easily cover the rest of their hidden debts, with plenty of cash left over for a luxurious tropical vacation. They were examining my life insurance policy like starving vultures circling a dying animal. The sheer unapologetic audacity of breaking into my locked private cabinet and plotting to drain my emergency funds right outside my bedroom door sent a surge of pure icy rage directly through my veins. But I did not move a single muscle. I kept my eyes closed and let my breathing remain perfectly steady. I decided to let them think I was asleep. I decided to let them think they had already won. The cruelty reached its absolute peak the very following Saturday evening. Chloe decided it was the perfect time to celebrate their new living arrangement by hosting a lavish catered dinner party for her wealthy superficial friends from the local country club. Early that morning, she marched into my tiny guest room and explicitly ordered me to stay completely out of sight for the entire night. She stated that her friends were sophisticated, high-class people, and she absolutely did not want them feeling uncomfortable or awkward around a confused, depressing, elderly woman. I sat alone in the cramped room, listening to the sharp clinking of expensive crystal glasses and the loud, obnoxious laughter echoing from the formal dining room directly below me. They were carelessly eating off the delicate, expensive bone china Thomas had bought me for our 25th wedding anniversary. Those beautiful plates were meant for sacred family celebrations for Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas hams, not for a group of arrogant, greedy strangers. Driven by a potent mix of boiling anger and morbid curiosity, I quietly slipped out of my room and crept silently down the carpeted back staircase, hiding myself in the deep shadows near the kitchen pantry. The grand dining room doors were wide open. Chloe was holding a large glass of red wine, holding court at the head of my table like a fake queen. I listened in absolute horror as she actively and maliciously mocked my background to her captive audience. She laughed cruelly about my 4 decades of working exhausting night shifts at the hospital, calling me a glorified bedpan cleaner who only got lucky by marrying a decent, hard-working earner. Her friends chuckled politely, sipping their expensive wine and nodding along with her vicious insults. Then Chloe raised her glass high into the air and made a sickening toast. She proudly boasted to the room that she and Lucas had finally taken total control of the entire estate. She smiled that wicked, triumphant smile and told her friends that they essentially owned everything now. She bragged openly about how incredibly easy it was to manage a fading, clueless old woman and how soon they would be liquidating all the boring, dusty antique furniture to completely modernize the space into a contemporary masterpiece. I stood completely frozen in the dark pantry, pressing my trembling hand firmly against my mouth to stop myself from making a single sound. My own son, the boy I carried and nurtured, was sitting right there at the other end of the table, quietly drinking his wine, while his wife publicly humiliated the mother who had given him absolutely everything. He did not raise his voice to defend me. He did not correct her vicious lies. He just sat there and let her erase my entire existence for the fleeting amusement of her pretentious friends. Long after midnight, when the final loud guest had finally left the property and Chloe and Lucas had stumbled heavily up the stairs to sleep off their expensive wine, I walked slowly into the dining room. The place was an absolute disrespectful disaster. Dirty, smeared plates were stacked haphazardly across the table, dark wine spills were staining the beautiful mahogany wood, and half-empty glass bottles were scattered carelessly across the counters. I began to silently and methodically clean up their disgusting mess, gathering the delicate dishes with practiced precision so they would not chip. As I moved toward this kitchen island to drop off a heavy stack of plates, something highly unusual caught my eye. Bryce had been at the dinner party earlier that evening, and he had carelessly left a thick, unmarked manila folder resting dangerously close to the edge of one of the leather bar stools. The folder was slightly open, and I could clearly see the bold logo of a sketchy, unlicensed real estate appraisal company printed on the top page. I put the fragile plates down on the granite counter and slowly pulled the folder toward me under the dim yellow light of the stove hood. Inside the folder were highly detailed appraisal documents for my entire property, but the final numbers listed at the bottom were completely wrong. The property was heavily and intentionally undervalued, listed for roughly half of what it was actually worth on the current housing market. I realized immediately that Bryce was planning to buy the house himself through a shady anonymous shell company for absolute pennies on the dollar. But the most damning, terrifying piece of evidence was tucked right behind those fake appraisal sheets. It was a formal legal draft for a comprehensive power of attorney document. I read the dense legal jargon with growing, suffocating horror. This specific document did not just grant them basic control over my future medical decisions. It explicitly and permanently granted Bryce and Chloe full, unrestricted legal authority to authorize the immediate sale of the house and instantly transfer all financial proceeds directly into their own personal bank accounts. They were not even putting Lucas on the main transfer documents, completely cutting my son out of the actual legal ownership. The terrifying reality of their aggressive timeline finally slammed into my chest. They were not waiting for the standard reading of the will or the normal lengthy probate process. They knew perfectly well that if the estate went through proper legal channels, their massive hidden debts and total lack of actual ownership would be permanently exposed to a judge. They were actively and aggressively trying to liquidate my major assets right under my nose before any official probate court could catch up to their criminal scheme. I carefully folded the papers and placed the documents back into the manila folder exactly the way I had found them so Bryce would never suspect a thing. My hands were shaking violently, not from fear or sadness, but from the massive, overwhelming weight of the battle that now lay ahead of me. I knew exactly what they were planning down to the exact dollar amount. I knew they were trying to steal my beloved home and drain my entire life savings. But simply knowing their evil plan was not enough to stop them. I needed solid, irrefutable legal proof of their criminal conspiracy. I needed concrete, hard evidence that would not just stop their eviction process, but completely and permanently destroy their vicious plot. I needed a foolproof way to catch them confessing their financial crimes out loud, and as I stared into the dark kitchen, I knew exactly how I was going to do it. I knew the exact layout of my kitchen better than the back of my own hand. I knew exactly where the afternoon shadows fell across the granite counters and where a tiny piece of black plastic would go completely unnoticed by anyone who was not looking for it. Thomas had an old digital voice recorder he used for decades. He would sit in his quiet study late at night and dictate complex administrative notes for the hospital board. It was small and discreet, and it had a battery that lasted for days on end. I found it tucked away in the very back of his bottom desk drawer right next to his favorite fountain pens. I took a piece of heavy double-sided mounting tape and pressed the recording device firmly under the thick granite overhang of the kitchen island. It was completely hidden from view, but perfectly positioned to pick up every single whisper in the room. I knew Bryce was coming over that afternoon for what Chloe arrogantly called a strategy meeting. I played my part perfectly to ensure they felt entirely safe. I shuffled into the kitchen wearing my oldest bathrobe. I poured myself a glass of water with intentionally trembling hands and told Lucas I was feeling deeply confused and needed to take a long, uninterrupted nap. Lucas gave me a pathetic look of fake sympathy and gently guided me to the stairs like I was a fragile child. I walked into my room and closed my bedroom door and waited in the suffocating silence. After they finally left the house for dinner that evening, I crept silently downstairs and retrieved the recorder from under the counter. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs I thought it might burst. I locked myself inside my bathroom and put a single earbud into my ear and pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. Hearing my own son plot my total destruction was a physical agony I cannot adequately describe. It was like breathing in jagged shards of glass. Lucas did not sound manipulated or pressured. He sounded desperate and entirely complicit in the evil scheme. I heard Lucas pacing the kitchen floor heavily. He confessed to Bryce that he was drowning in a massive ocean of hidden debt. He had secretly blown $150,000 on reckless day trading and incredibly risky margin calls. He said his business was practically bankrupt, and the aggressive creditors were threatening to seize all his personal assets. He sounded pathetic and weak. Then Bryce chimed in with his grating and arrogant voice. Bryce loudly bragged that he had the absolute perfect solution to all their financial problems. He knew a shady doctor who had recently lost his medical license in another state due to malpractice, but was still quietly practicing locally under the radar. For a flat bribe of $10,000 in cash, this corrupt doctor would gladly sign a formal and legally binding declaration of severe dementia. Then I heard Chloe speak. Her voice was dripping with pure and unadulterated malice. She laughed a sharp and wicked laugh that echoed through the small speaker. She told them that once the old bat is locked up, we drain the accounts, sell the house to Bryce and his fake company for pennies, and flip it for $1 million. Hearing her call me an old bat while eagerly plotting to steal my entire life and throw me into a miserable institution was the exact catalyst I needed. The hot tears flowing down my cheeks stopped instantly. The profound sorrow of a grieving widow completely evaporated into the cold air. My chest tightened with a powerful and icy resolve. The boy I had raised with so much love and sacrifice was dead to me. The man speaking on that digital recording was a total stranger and a dangerous predator. I wiped my face aggressively and stood up straight. That was when a vital memory pierced through the chaotic noise in my mind. Just days before Thomas suffered his massive and fatal heart attack, he had been acting incredibly cautious and highly secretive. He had pulled me close to his chest while I was bringing him his evening tea in the living room. He whispered to me that if anything ever happened to him unexpectedly, I needed to go straight into the garage. He told me to look inside his heavy wooden woodworking tool chest, the beautiful one he had built by hand when we first bought the house. He said there was a false bottom carefully constructed beneath the upper wrench tray. He whispered that under that false bottom was a heavy brass key that would completely explain everything I needed to know about our future. I knew I had to get out of the house the very next morning to find out exactly what Thomas had left for me. When the sun came up and the house began to stir, I put on a spectacular and convincing performance. I clutched my head and groaned loudly, claiming I had a blinding and debilitating migraine. I stumbled out of my room and begged Chloe to keep all the lights off and the noise down so I could rest in absolute darkness. Chloe rolled her eyes, clearly disgusted by my mere presence, and told me to just stay in my room and stop bothering her while she enjoyed her morning coffee. It was exactly what I needed her to do. As soon as I heard her turn on the loud television downstairs in the living room, I quickly changed into my regular street clothes. I grabbed my purse and slipped quietly out the back patio door, making sure the hinges did not squeak. I walked briskly through the neighborhood until I was 2 full blocks away from the property. I hailed a passing taxi and told the driver to take me straight to the busy downtown financial district. I walked into the grand marble lobby of the central bank with a singular and unwavering focus. I presented my identification and the small, heavy brass key to the vault manager. He nodded respectfully and escorted me deep into the highly secure underground vault. He left me completely alone in a small and quiet viewing room with a long metal box resting on a polished wooden table. My hands shook violently as I lifted the heavy metal lid. Inside, resting perfectly on top of a remarkably thick stack of legal documents, was a handwritten letter from my sweet Thomas. I unfolded the crisp paper and read his familiar and neat handwriting. Thomas wrote that he had seen right through Chloe and her fake smiles from the very first day Lucas proudly brought her home. He wrote that he had quietly hired a private investigator many months ago and uncovered the horrific extent of Lucas and his dangerous gambling addictions and reckless trading debts. Thomas knew without a doubt that they would eventually try to bleed us dry to save themselves. He knew they would view me as an incredibly easy target once he was gone and could no longer protect me. So my brilliant and fiercely protective husband had completely bypassed the traditional and public probate court system. He had quietly and legally transferred our family home, our massive retirement savings accounts, and all his lucrative stock portfolios into a highly restricted, irrevocable trust. The certified documents stacked beneath the letter confirmed it all in undeniable black and white ink. I was the sole and uncontested trustee of the entire estate. I controlled absolutely everything and they owned absolutely nothing. I gathered the heavy documents and placed them safely into my large leather tote bag and marched directly out of the bank with my head held high. I walked 3 blocks down the bustling city street until I reached a towering and modern glass office building. I took the express elevator all the way to the penthouse floor and walked confidently into the prestigious law firm of Harrison Cole. Mr. Cole was a legendary and feared attorney in our city. He was ruthless, incredibly sharp, and notoriously aggressive in the courtroom. When his secretary ushered me into his expansive corner office, he stood up immediately and offered a warm and highly knowing smile. He told me he had been expecting my visit for quite some time. Mr. Cole poured me a cup of hot black coffee and sat across from me at his massive polished mahogany desk. He carefully reviewed the trust documents I brought and confirmed that my legal and financial position was entirely bulletproof. He then pointed to a specific highlighted page in the thick legal binder and explained the true absolute genius of what Thomas had built to protect me. Thomas had deliberately inserted a devastating poison pill clause deep into the trust documents. Mr. Cole explained that if Lucas ever attempted to contest my residency in the home, challenge my mental competency, or try to force me into a medical facility against my will, he would be instantaneously and permanently disinherited from the entire estate. He would not receive a single dime of the family money ever again. But the trap Thomas laid was even more brilliant and punishing than just a simple disinheritance. Mr. Cole revealed a secret that made my jaw drop. The massive seed money Lucas originally used to start his failing business years ago was not a generous gift from his father like Lucas always believed. It was actually a high-interest commercial loan bankrolled directly by a private holding company that Thomas secretly managed. Because that holding company was now completely absorbed into the new trust, I held the ultimate financial power over my son. The very moment Lucas violated the poison pill clause by trying to commit me, the trust had the absolute legal right to call that massive commercial loan in immediately and in full. I felt a massive and intoxicating wave of triumph wash over my entire body. I wanted to run straight back home, slap those certified legal documents down on the kitchen island, and throw Chloe and Lucas out into the cold street right then and there. I wanted to watch their arrogant faces crumble into dust. But Mr. Cole raised a steady hand and calmly stopped me. He looked at me with incredibly serious and sharp eyes. He explained that we absolutely could not reveal our winning hand just yet. We had the secret audio recording of their criminal conspiracy, but to completely destroy them legally, financially, and criminally, we needed them to fully execute their evil plan on paper. We needed them to proudly hand over that forged medical document to the authorities. We needed them to officially and undeniably cross the legal line into federal wire fraud and severe elder abuse. Mr. Cole leaned forward over his mahogany desk, and his voice became completely calm but deadly serious. He told me I had to go back to my house and walk right back into the lion den. He said I had to play the part of the broken and confused victim perfectly for just a few more days. I had to let them think they had outsmarted me and won the war. I had to go back to the home I owned and literally let them pack my garbage bags. I took a deep breath before turning the brass knob of my own front door. Mr. Cole had given me strict instructions. I had to let them commit the fraud completely. I had to play the victim so convincingly that they would not suspect a single thing. When I stepped into the foyer, the air inside the house felt thick and heavy. I did not have to look far to find them. Lucas, Chloe, and Bryce were sitting together in the formal living room. They were positioned around my expensive oak coffee table, like a ruthless tribunal waiting to pass judgment. Bryce was leaning back on the sofa with his dirty boots resting right on the pristine upholstery. Chloe was sipping a glass of iced tea with a deeply satisfied smirk painted across her face. Lucas was sitting rigidly in his father's old armchair. He would not even look me in the eye. Bryce was the first one to speak. He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh and tossed a thick manila envelope onto the center of the coffee table. He told me my little afternoon walk was the last taste of freedom I was going to get. He leaned forward and tapped the envelope with his greasy fingers. He proudly announced that he had just returned from a very special appointment with a top medical professional. My heart pounded hard against my ribs, but I forced my hands to shake as I slowly approached the table. I asked him what he was talking about. Chloe stood up and smoothed out her expensive designer skirt. She walked over and pulled a crisp white document from the envelope. It had the official letterhead of a medical clinic and a messy signature at the bottom. Chloe practically shoved the paper into my face. She read the bold letters aloud with pure venom in her voice. The document was a legally binding medical evaluation. It officially declared that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing cognitive decline. The corrupt doctor Bryce had bribed had signed his name to a blatant lie, stating on the public record that I was completely unfit to live independently and required immediate lockdown residential care. Chloe smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and told me I was officially a danger to society. I looked at Lucas. I channeled every ounce of genuine sorrow I had felt over the past few weeks and let the tears well up in my eyes. I asked my son if he actually believed these vicious lies. I asked him how he could sit there and let a stranger sign a fake document saying his own mother was crazy. Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his chair and stared down at the expensive rug. He muttered that it was for my own good. He said I had been acting unstable, and they had to protect the family assets from my confusion. Hearing him justify a criminal conspiracy with such a weak, pathetic excuse made my stomach turn. That was when Lucas stood up and pulled a second document from his jacket pocket. It was a comprehensive power of attorney form. It explicitly granted him and Chloe total control over my finances, my health care, and the immediate sale of my property. He grabbed a heavy silver pen from the table and aggressively pushed it right into my trembling hand. His voice was cold and hollow. He told me to just sign the paper voluntarily. He said if I signed it right now, they would make the transition easy and peaceful. He promised they would find a somewhat decent place for me to live. I let the hot tears spill down my cheeks. I dropped to my knees right in front of the coffee table, clutching my chest as if I were having a panic attack. I gave them the absolute performance of a lifetime. I begged him. I cried out loud. I asked Lucas to remember all the sacrifices his father and I had made for him. I reminded him of the long night shifts at the hospital, the college tuition we paid in full, and the unconditional love we gave him every single day of his life. I sobbed uncontrollably, asking him how he could possibly do this to the woman who raised him. I begged him to look into his heart and find just a tiny piece of the good man his father raised. Lucas looked down at me sobbing on the floor. His face hardened into a mask of pure, unapologetic greed. He did not show a single ounce of guilt. He did not offer a hand to help me up. He simply looked at me with dead eyes and said it was just business. He told me I was nothing but a liability to his future, and he could not afford to carry dead weight anymore. Those words severed the very last string of maternal attachment I had left for him. He was not my son. He was a monster. I slowly stopped crying. I let the silver pen roll out of my hand and drop onto the hardwood floor with a loud clatter. I looked up at them and shook my head. I told them in a weak, breathless voice that I would never sign my life away to them. I refused to give them my signature. Chloe let out a sharp, cruel laugh that echoed off the living room walls. She stepped closer and looked down at me with absolute contempt. She said my signature did not matter anyway. She told me the medical evaluation was more than enough to have me forcibly removed. She crossed her arms and delivered her final ultimatum. She said Friday morning a transport team was coming to collect me. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile and told me that on Friday morning I would be thrown out of the house like the trash I truly was. I spent the next 2 days completely isolated in the tiny guest room. I did not speak to them. I did not eat with them. I simply sat on the edge of the small bed and waited for the trap to spring. Friday morning arrived with a bitter, freezing chill that seeped through the windows. The tension inside the house was absolutely suffocating. I could hear Bryce and Lucas laughing loudly in the kitchen, drinking coffee and celebrating their impending payday. Suddenly, the guest room door flew open. Chloe stood in the doorway holding something bundled in her hands. She did not bring me my sturdy leather suitcases. She did not bring me boxes for my personal items. She violently threw 2 flimsy black plastic garbage bags right at my feet. The bags landed on the carpet with a pathetic rustle. Chloe sneered at me and told me to pack quickly. She specifically instructed me to only take cheap clothing. She refused to let me use proper luggage, stating with a cruel laugh that I would not have room for luxury items where I was going. She told me the state facility did not allow patients to bring valuables because they would just get stolen by the other crazy people. I slowly bent down and picked up the black garbage bags. I silently began folding my simplest sweaters and pants, placing them into the plastic exactly as she demanded. I played the role of the defeated, broken old woman flawlessly. I kept my head bowed and my shoulders slumped, but tightly clutched inside my small leather purse resting on the bed was the digital voice recorder and the crisp white business card of Mr. Harrison Cole. When I finished packing my pathetic garbage bags, I dragged them out into the upstairs hallway. I slowly walked down the main staircase and witnessed the ultimate insult to my husband's memory. Bryce was actively looting my home right in front of my face. He had backed his rusty pickup truck right up to the front porch doors. He was carrying my heavy antique silver serving trays, the beautiful heirlooms Thomas had bought for me in Charleston 30 years ago. Bryce was tossing the expensive silver carelessly into the bed of his dirty truck. The metal clinked loudly against the rusty truck bed. He was laughing with Lucas about how much cash the pawn shop down the street would give them for the raw silver weight. Chloe was standing in the grand foyer with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched her brother steal my most prized possessions with a look of intense satisfaction. She turned to Lucas and rubbed his shoulders affectionately. I heard her whisper to him that they finally owned everything. She looked around my beautiful home and proudly declared that the nightmare was over and they were finally rich. I stood silently at the bottom of the stairs, holding the plastic ties of my garbage bags. I said absolutely nothing. I just watched them incriminate themselves. I watched them cross every single legal and moral boundary in existence. I clutched my purse so tightly, my knuckles turned entirely white. I stared out the large front window, waiting and praying that Mr. Cole would arrive on time. Suddenly, a loud, rumbling engine broke through the quiet morning air. A large, rusted white transport van pulled slowly into my long driveway. The side of the van had the faded logo of a low-budget medical transport service. This was the horrible vehicle Bryce had hired to forcefully drag me to the state lockdown facility. Two large men wearing cheap blue scrubs stepped out of the van and began walking toward my front porch. Chloe smiled brightly and told me my ride to the asylum was finally here. My heart pounded furiously against my chest. The orderlies were walking up the front steps. I took a deep breath, wondering if the plan had somehow failed. But right before the heavy orderlies could even ring my doorbell, the loud screech of expensive tires echoed through the entire neighborhood. A sleek, flawless black town car swerved aggressively into my driveway, moving so incredibly fast that it completely blocked the rusty medical transport van from moving an inch. The black car parked horizontally across the concrete, trapping the van in place. The heavy doors of the town car swung open simultaneously. Two tall, highly intimidating uniformed sheriff deputies stepped out first. Their hands rested professionally on their duty belts as they flanked the vehicle. Then the rear door opened. Mr. Harrison Cole stepped out into the freezing morning air. He was wearing an immaculate, razor-sharp charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He adjusted his tie and walked purposefully up my front walkway, flanked by the armed law enforcement officers. Chloe rushed to the open front door. Her triumphant smile instantly replaced by a look of sheer panicked confusion. She yelled out, asking who these people were and what they were doing on her property. Mr. Cole did not even blink. He stopped right at the edge of the porch, looked Chloe dead in the eye with a gaze as cold as absolute zero, and spoke in a booming, authoritative voice that rattled the windows. He told her that nobody was going anywhere. The two uniformed sheriff deputies stepped heavily onto my front porch, with their hands resting securely on their duty belts. Their sheer physical presence instantly sucked all the arrogant oxygen right out of the morning air. Mr. Harrison Cole walked calmly between them in his flawless charcoal suit. He did not wait for an invitation. He did not ask for permission. He simply stepped past the threshold of my front door and walked directly into the grand foyer of my home. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind him, echoing loudly through the silent house. Chloe was completely paralyzed. Her mouth fell wide open in sheer shock. Just seconds ago, she was a triumphant queen, celebrating her stolen wealth, but now she looked like a terrified child. She finally found her voice and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She shrieked at the top of her voice, demanding to know who these men were and ordering them to get out of her house immediately. She yelled that she was the owner of this property and they were trespassing. Mr. Cole did not even flinch at her hysterical screaming. He completely ignored her as if she were nothing more than an annoying insect buzzing in the background. He walked with absolute authority straight into the formal living room. He placed his thick leather briefcase squarely in the center of the expensive oak coffee table, the same table where my son and his greedy wife had sat just days prior plotting to throw me into a state-run asylum. Mr. Cole turned his gaze toward me. His eyes were completely respectful and deeply kind. He offered me a gentle nod and spoke in a clear, calm voice. "Mrs. Harper, shall we begin?" Lucas finally snapped out of his bewildered trance. He marched into the living room, puffing out his chest, trying desperately to look like the man of the house. He demanded to know what on earth was going on and who this arrogant lawyer thought he was. Bryce followed closely behind him, dropping a handful of my antique silver spoons onto the carpeted floor as his hands began to shake. Mr. Cole slowly unclasped the shiny brass locks of his briefcase. The loud metallic clicks sounded like a judge dropping a heavy wooden gavel. He reached inside and pulled out a massive, pristine stack of legal papers bound in a thick blue folder. He looked directly at Lucas and informed him that he was the executor of Thomas Harper's estate. Mr. Cole held the documents up to the morning light. He announced in a booming voice that he was there to formally read the terms of the updated, irrevocable trust established by my late husband. Chloe stopped screaming. Her face turned the color of chalk. Lucas crossed his arms tightly across his chest, trying to hide his visible trembling. Mr. Cole began to read the legally binding terms aloud. His voice was sharp and unforgiving. He read the exact clauses detailing that this property, the very house we were standing inside, did not belong to Lucas. It did not belong to Chloe. It belonged entirely to the trust. And the sole uncontested trustee with absolute and permanent control over every single asset was me, Evelyn Harper. I stood tall by the doorway. I let the heavy black plastic garbage bags fall from my hands. I felt a massive surge of power flow through my entire body. I watched my son realize that he owned absolutely nothing. I watched the greedy, arrogant smirk completely melt off Chloe's face, but she was not ready to surrender. Her greed was a sickness that blinded her to reality. She let out a frantic, desperate gasp and lunged toward her expensive designer purse resting on the console table. She frantically dug her manicured nails into the bag and pulled out the crisp, white medical document they had bought with dirty money. Chloe slammed the forged doctor's note down onto the oak coffee table right next to Mr. Cole's briefcase. She slammed her hand flat against the paper and screamed that the trust did not matter at all. She yelled that she had official, undeniable medical proof that I was severely demented and legally incompetent. She shrieked that I was completely unfit to manage my own life, let alone a massive financial estate. She pointed her shaking finger right at my face and told the sheriff deputies that I was a danger to society and needed to be hauled away immediately. She truly believed that fake piece of paper was her ultimate winning ticket. She thought she had outsmarted a man who had practiced ruthless corporate law for 40 years. Mr. Cole did not look worried. In fact, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the deeply predatory smile of a shark that had just cornered its bleeding prey. He reached into his perfectly tailored suit jacket pocket. He did not pull out another legal document. He pulled out the small digital voice recorder I had hidden under the kitchen island. He placed the black device gently right on top of their forged medical evaluation. He looked at Chloe with eyes as cold as a frozen lake. He told her he was sincerely hoping she would present that specific fraudulent document today. He informed her in a deadly whisper that by placing that forged paper on the table, she had just triggered the clause. Mr. Cole reached down and firmly pressed the play button on the small digital recorder. The scratchy, undeniable audio filled the deafening silence of my living room. Lucas, Chloe, and Bryce were forced to stand there and listen to their own cruel voices echoing off the walls. They heard Bryce bragging loudly about finding a corrupt, desperate doctor who had lost his medical license. They heard the exact details of the $10,000 cash bribe. They heard Lucas whining about his massive hidden debts and his failed day trading accounts. But the absolute worst part was hearing Chloe. Her wicked, vicious laughter played loudly from the speaker as she bragged about locking the old bat up, draining the emergency accounts, selling the family house to a shady LLC for pennies, and flipping it for $1 million. The blood instantly drained from their faces. They looked like walking corpses. Bryce took a cowardly step backward toward the front door, trying to silently escape the room. But the two sheriff deputies immediately stepped forward, blocking his only exit. One of the large deputies firmly placed his heavy hand on the forged medical document resting on the coffee table. He slid it carefully into a clear plastic evidence bag. He looked directly at Chloe and Bryce and informed them that this document was now officially seized as state evidence. He announced in a booming voice that they were all currently under active criminal investigation for severe elder abuse conspiracy to commit medical fraud and federal wire fraud. The absolute terror in their eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The arrogant bullies who had tormented me, gaslighted me, and tried to erase my existence were completely paralyzed by fear. But Mr. Cole was not finished. He picked up his legal binder and prepared to drop the final devastating hammer on my treacherous son. He turned to Lucas and read the specific wording of the poison pill clause that my brilliant husband Thomas had secretly drafted. Mr. Cole explained that because Lucas had actively attempted to contest my legal residency using fraudulent and criminal means, he was now instantly and permanently disinherited from the entire Harper estate. He would never see a single dime of his father's hard-earned money. Lucas fell back into the armchair, clutching his chest as if he could not breathe. But the punishment went so much deeper than simply losing an inheritance. Mr. Cole turned the page and revealed the darkest financial secret of all. He announced that the massive commercial lease for Bryce's failing real estate business and all of Lucas's reckless day trading margin debts were entirely guaranteed by a private holding company. A holding company that was now legally absorbed into my irrevocable trust. The very moment Lucas tried to commit me to an asylum, he handed me total control over his entire financial existence. Mr. Cole looked down at my son and delivered the crushing blow. He stated that the holding company was officially calling in every single business loan and line of credit in full effective immediately. He told them they currently owed the trust exactly $150,000. The payments were due in exactly 30 days. If they failed to produce the cash, they would face total catastrophic bankruptcy, followed by severe criminal prosecution for the stolen funds. The false bravado, the cruel smirks, the aggressive entitlement, it all evaporated into thin air. Chloe's legs literally gave out beneath her. She dropped heavily to her knees right there on my living room carpet. Her expensive designer skirt bunched up around her waist as she began to sob hysterically. She frantically pointed her shaking finger at her brother Bryce, screaming through her tears that it was all his stupid idea. She sobbed that he had forced her to go along with the medical fraud and she was just an innocent victim. Bryce yelled back, calling her a greedy liar, creating a pathetic, chaotic display of two rats turning on each other on a sinking ship. Then I looked at Lucas. The boy I had carried in my womb, the boy I had worked countless exhausting hospital shifts to provide for, was completely broken. He slid out of the armchair and fell to his knees right beside his weeping wife. He looked up at me with a face completely covered in hot, pathetic tears. He crawled slightly forward, reaching his trembling hands out toward my shoes. He sobbed uncontrollably, claiming he was heavily manipulated by Chloe and her brother. He cried like a helpless toddler, begging his mommy to please stop the lawyers and make the nightmare go away. He pleaded for mercy, asking me to remember how much he loved me. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic, weeping man crawling on my floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of maternal weakness. I felt an absolute pure and unbreakable clarity. I looked at the son I had sacrificed my entire life for. I slowly raised my hand and pointed a steady finger directly at the two flimsy black plastic garbage bags resting in the hallway. The very same trash bags Chloe had thrown at my feet just hours ago. I looked him dead in the eye and spoke with a voice as cold and hard as solid steel. I told him he had packed my bags. I told him now it was time to go pack his. The heavy silence in the living room was broken only by the sharp metallic click of handcuffs. One of the deputies stepped forward, grabbed Bryce by the arm, and secured his wrists tightly behind his back. Bryce tried to shout and tried to bargain, but the deputy simply read him his rights and marched him out the front door for attempted fraud and conspiracy. I stood tall with my shoulders pulled back, no longer the frail old woman they thought they could crush. Mr. Cole turned his attention to Chloe and Lucas, who were still trembling on my beautiful hardwood floor. He pulled out a sleek silver pocket watch, checked the time, and delivered the final blow. They were given exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises, 1 hour to leave the home they had tried to steal. Chloe gasped, begging for more time, claiming she needed to call movers and pack her designer clothes. Mr. Cole coldly reminded her that everything purchased with the estate money remained with the estate. They were allowed to take only the clothes on their backs and whatever fit into their hands. I walked over to the hallway, picked up the two flimsy black plastic trash bags Chloe had thrown at my feet that very morning, and tossed them gently onto the coffee table. "You packed my bags," I said with my voice steady and completely devoid of pity. "Now go pack yours." The sheer humiliation on Chloe's face was a masterpiece. She grabbed the bags with shaking hands, with her mascara running down her cheeks, completely stripped of her arrogant pride. Lucas did not even look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, dragging his feet as he followed his wife up the stairs. I walked out onto the front porch, wrapping my favorite shawl around my shoulders, and breathed in the crisp, freezing January air. Exactly 60 minutes later, they walked out my front door for the last time. They carried their meager belongings in those shiny black garbage bags, dragging them down the driveway under the watchful eyes of the remaining sheriff. I stood on the porch, sipping a hot cup of coffee, watching them load their trash bags into a cheap taxi they had been forced to call. They drove away, and the heavy, suffocating darkness that had plagued my home finally lifted. In the weeks that followed, the absolute destruction of their lives unfolded exactly as Mr. Cole had promised. Without my husband's hidden wealth to prop them up, their fake glamorous reality crumbled into dust. The federal investigations into the wire fraud and elder abuse conspiracy moved swiftly. The massive legal fees drained whatever secret cash they had left. The crushing weight of the $150,000 debt they owed my trust completely suffocated their marriage. Chloe, who had always valued status and wealth above all else, could not handle the poverty and the public shame. Their toxic marriage imploded in a spectacular, bitter divorce. With her reputation in the local country club completely destroyed and her wealthy friends entirely abandoning her, Chloe was forced to move back into a cramped, tiny apartment with her elderly parents. She went from hosting lavish dinner parties on my expensive china to sleeping on a fold-out couch in a living room, utterly disgraced and alone. Lucas faced an even harsher reality. His failing business was liquidated to pay a fraction of what he owed the estate. With his professional reputation in ruins and the looming threat of prison hanging over his head, he had no choice but to take the only job that would hire him. The son I had sent to an expensive private college was now working long, grueling hours at a minimum wage retail job, forced to send nearly every paycheck directly to Mr. Cole's office to slowly pay off the massive debt he owed to his own mother. He tried to call me once. He left a pathetic, crying voicemail begging for forgiveness, begging for his mommy to save him one last time. I deleted the message before he even finished his sentence. I had no son. The boy I raised had died the moment he watched his wife throw his father's necktie into the trash. Today my life is incredibly quiet, peaceful, and entirely my own. The cold January winter has finally melted away, replaced by the warm golden sun of a beautiful spring. I am sitting comfortably on my back porch, nestled in my favorite cushioned wicker chair, drinking sweet chamomile tea from my favorite porcelain cup. I watch the sun slowly dip below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of orange and purple. The house is completely silent, but it is no longer the suffocating silence of grief or the terrifying silence of being a prisoner in my own home. It is the beautiful, liberating silence of absolute freedom. I have hired a wonderful team to help me update the house, painting the walls with bright, cheerful colors and planting vibrant new flower beds in the garden Thomas loved so much. I took a significant portion of my immense wealth and established a legal foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly widows from financial abuse and domestic fraud. I spend my days working with brilliant lawyers like Mr. Cole, ensuring that no other grieving mother ever has to face the terror of being erased by the very people she trusted most. I smile, breathing in the fresh air, completely at peace with the world and with myself. I willingly traded the dangerous illusion of a loving family for the absolute, undeniable power of my own independence. I do not miss them. I do not feel guilty. I only feel a profound sense of pride for the woman I discovered inside myself when everything was on the line. Never mistake a mother's silent grief for weakness. People often think that a grieving widow is a fragile, broken thing, easily manipulated and easily discarded. But they forget the decades of quiet strength it takes to raise a family, build a life, and survive the darkest storms. Because when you push a woman who has survived a lifetime of storms, you will not break her. You will only teach her exactly how to summon the lightning. If you enjoyed my story, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life stories. Thank you for listening, and always remember to protect your peace. Until next time.